The box of books was the last of it. I slid it across the scuffed linoleum floor with my foot, the cardboard catching and sticking with a soft, tearing sound. The room smelled like lemon-scented disinfectant and new paint, a smell that was supposed to mean a fresh start, but just made my nose itch. My side of the dorm room was stark. A single bed with the plain navy comforter I'd bought on sale at Target, a stack of textbooks on the desk, and a small, framed photo of my parents and me at my high school graduation. My dad's arm was tight around my shoulders, his smile proud but weary. That was the entirety of my life, unpacked and arranged in under an hour. The other side of the room looked like a boutique had exploded. Garment bags in sleek black plastic were strewn across the bed, their contents spilling out in a riot of silk, cashmere, and labels I'd only seen in magazines. Chloe Davenport stood in the center of the chaos, holding up a pair of heels that looked more like sculptural art than footwear. She was tall and willowy, with hair the color of honey that fell in perfect, glossy waves. She arrived an hour after me, trailed by a silent, grim-faced man her father had hired to carry up her things. He'd left without a word, and Chloe had set to work with the focused intensity of a general deploying troops. "You simply cannot trust movers with suede in this humidity," she announced, though I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or to herself. She caught my eye and offered a quick, brilliant smile. It was a powerful thing, that smile, like a flashbulb going off. "I'm Chloe, by the way. I'd shake your hand, but—" She wiggled her fingers, which were currently occupied with untangling the straps of a lavender camisole. "Eve," I said. "Eve Vance." "Eve Strong, biblical," she nodded approvingly. "So, what's your poison? Pre-law? Pre-med? My father's pushing law, but God, all those boring suits. I'm thinking maybe communications, something with a good social calendar." I bent to unpack my box of books, placing my economics textbook next to the thick, blue Air Force ROTC manual. Aeronautical engineering. Her eyebrows shot up. "Seriously? Wow, that sounds hard." The way she said hard made it synonymous with tedious and unfashionable. "Are your parents engineers?" "No," I said, a familiar defensive wall sliding into place. "My dad manages a hardware store. My mom's a librarian." I didn't add that the ROTC scholarship was the only reason I was standing in this room, that the full ride covering tuition and room and board was the culmination of 4 years of straight A's, obsessive physical training, and a single-minded determination to get out of our small town without burying my family in debt. "Oh," Chloe said, and I heard the subtle shift in her tone, the recategorization. I was no longer a potential peer from a similar world, but an interesting specimen from another planet. "Well, that's practical." She turned back to her wardrobe, holding a blouse against her front and studying her reflection in the dark screen of the window. "I suppose someone has to build the planes." The divide was established before the sun went down. My side was functional, austere. Hers was a monument to curated luxury. That first week, we orbited each other like polite strangers, our schedules ensuring we barely overlapped. I was up at 5:00 a.m. for runs before my 8:00 a.m. calculus class. She rolled in after 2:00 a.m. from parties, smelling of cigarette smoke and expensive perfume. We were two different species, occupying the same habitat, a fact that was about to become painfully public. It happened on a Thursday, during what Chloe had dubbed her pre-rush strategizing session. I was returning from the library, my shoulders aching from the first proper physical training session with the ROTC detachment that afternoon. I was still buzzing with a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. As I approached our door, I heard the bright, overlapping chatter of multiple female voices. I hesitated, my hand on the cool metal doorknob, not wanting to walk into a room full of strangers judging my sweatpants and messy ponytail. Then I heard my name. "Eve, God no, we're total opposites," Chloe was saying, her voice amplified by a speakerphone. "She's like a robot, up at the crack of dawn, always studying. And get this, she's in ROTC." A chorus of exaggerated groans and laughs echoed from the phone. "ROTC? Seriously, what is this, a military academy?" one voice chirped. "I know," Chloe said, and I could picture her dramatic eye roll. "I found this binder on her desk." My stomach dropped. I'd left my ROTC manual out. It's full of, rules for making your bed and diagrams of airplanes. It's the saddest thing I've ever seen. My face burned. I felt exposed, as if she'd read my private journal aloud. I should have walked in, I should have confronted her. But my feet were rooted to the spot, a hot shame washing over me. Chloe laughed, a light, tinkling sound that grated on my ears. I'm telling you, ROTC is for losers who can't get a real scholarship, or who have no other options. It's just so desperate. The word desperate hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't true, I knew it wasn't true. It was a choice, my choice, a path of discipline and purpose. But in that moment, filtered through Chloe's dismissive scorn, the certainty I'd felt just hours ago wavered. I backed away from the door, retreating down the hall to the common room, where I sat staring at a flickering television until I was sure her friends were gone. The next morning, I sought refuge in the one place I knew I wouldn't be mocked, the ROTC detachment headquarters. It was an unassuming building on the edge of campus, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. I found Lena Petrova there, hunched over an aerospace textbook in the lounge. She had been at the PT session too, a compact girl with dark hair pulled into a ruthlessly tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been the only one who hadn't looked like she was about to vomit after Sergeant Miller's conditioning circuit. "Hey, Vance," she said without looking up, "still feeling your legs?" "Feeling everything," I grunted, sinking into the chair opposite her. The vinyl squeaked in protest. She glanced up then, and her sharp eyes narrowed. "You look like you lost a fight with a philosophy paper. What's wrong?" I hesitated. Confessing felt weak, like I was tattling. But the words spilled out anyway, a quiet torrent about the designer clothes, the late nights, and the conversation I'd overheard. "She called ROTC for losers," I finished, the phrase tasting bitter in my mouth. Lena listened, her expression unchanging. When I was done, she snapped her textbook shut. "Davenport, sorority row, right? Dad's some big shot financier from Greenwich." I nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" "I make it my business to know things," she said with a shrug. "Look, Eve, forget her. She's a tourist. She's here for the 4-year party, the connections, the MRS degree. We're here to work. We have a different destination." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And between you and me, Sergeant Miller doesn't think you're a loser. He was watching you during the run. He likes your grit." A small, warm ember of pride glowed in my chest, momentarily pushing back the chill of Chloe's words. "He has a funny way of showing it. I thought he was going to make us do push-ups until our arms fell off." "That's the idea," Lena said, a dry smile touching her lips. "He's not here to be our friend. He's here to make sure we don't get ourselves or anyone else killed someday. Consider the pain a compliment." Later that week, the conflict moved from a Cold War to a formal diplomatic incident. Chloe's parents were in town and had taken us to dinner at a restaurant so hushed and elegantly lit it felt more like a museum. The napkins were stiff linen, the silverware heavy and cold. Mr. Davenport was a man with a perpetual tan and a watch that probably cost more than my dad's car. Mrs. Davenport was a slimmer, older version of Chloe, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "So, Evelyn," Mr. Davenport began, after the waiter had taken our order. He pronounced my name with a formality that felt like a test. "Chloe tells us you're studying engineering. Ambitious." "Yes, sir," I said, keeping my hands folded in my lap. "And you're involved with the ROTC program?" Mrs. Davenport asked, her tone delicately probing, as if asking about a peculiar hobby. "That's a unique choice." "It's a great opportunity," I said, my standard, polite response. "It's teaching me discipline, and it's helping with the cost of school." Mr. Davenport chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. "Discipline is one thing, but you have to think about the return on investment, young lady. 4 years of your life, plus a service commitment afterwards. That's a long time to be earning a lieutenant's salary when your peers in the private sector will be well on their way." He took a sip of his wine. "I had a talk with one of our junior analysts just the other day. Fresh out of Princeton, starting bonus that would make your head spin. That's the kind of future you should be positioning yourself for." I felt my jaw tight. "I'm not just positioning myself for a salary, sir. I believe in the mission." "The mission," he repeated, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. He turned to Chloe. "You see, honey, that's the kind of idealism you get from," he trailed off, but the word public school hung in the air unsaid. Chloe shot me a look that was part apology, part warning. "Professor Albright was saying the same thing in Econ 101 yesterday." She jumped in. eager to steer the conversation onto safer, for her, ground. He said military spending is a drain on the economy and that the smartest minds are wasted in uniform. He said it's a refuge for those who can't compete in a true free market. The words stung, doubly so because they were delivered with such casual certainty. Professor Albright's lectures were already becoming infamous on campus, his cynical asides about government and institutions delivered with a wit that made them seem unassailable. To hear his ideology echoed by Chloe and tacitly endorsed by her parents made me feel incredibly small and foolish. My mission was a joke to them, a consolation prize. "I guess we'll have to see, won't we?" I said, my voice quieter than I intended. The rest of the meal was a blur of polite, painful small talk. I answered their questions about my family and my hometown with monosyllabic answers, retreating behind a wall of silence. I could feel Chloe's embarrassment radiating across the table, not for her parents' condescension, but for my inability to elegantly defend myself against it. The chasm between us was no longer just about money or social status. It was about fundamental values. They lived in a world of bottom lines and social leverage. I was choosing a world of duty and, what seemed to them, delayed gratification. Back in the dorm room, the silence was thick and heavy. Chloe finally broke it as she hung up her designer coat. "You didn't have to be so quiet, you know. They were just making conversation." "It didn't feel like conversation," I said, sitting at my desk and opening my economics book to the chapter authored by Professor Albright. It felt like an interrogation. "Well, what did you expect?" she said, a flash of irritation in her voice. "You can't just say you're joining the military and expect people not to have questions. It's an unusual path, Eve. Most people here are trying to achieve something." The implication that I wasn't hung in the air. I didn't respond. I just stared at the dense text on the page, the words swimming before my eyes. There was no point in arguing. We were speaking different languages. A few days later, the Cold War found a new front: financial aid. I was at my desk, working through a complex physics problem, the focused silence broken only by the scratch of my pencil. Chloe was on her bed, surrounded by a sea of official-looking paperwork. She let out a long, exasperated sigh. This is impossible," she muttered, throwing a form down in disgust. "Why does this have to be so complicated?" I glanced over. It was a student loan application. I was surprised. "I thought your parents were." "They are," she snapped, cutting me off. "But Daddy says I need to have some skin in the game. It's about financial literacy." She made air quotes with her fingers, her voice dripping with sarcasm. As if filling out this nonsense teaches me anything except how to be a bureaucratic peasant. I looked at the form, then at the pile of shopping bags from her excursion that afternoon. The disconnect was staggering. I thought of my own financial aid package, a complex mosaic of scholarships, grants, and the ROTC stipend that I tracked in a meticulous spreadsheet. Every dollar was accounted for. A missed stipend meant a week of eating ramen. For her, it was a lesson imposed by her father, a minor annoyance next to the real financial engine of her life. I turned back to my physics problem. "Just follow the instructions, it's not that hard." "Easy for you to say," she retorted. "You're probably an expert at this sort of thing." The comment was meant to be another jab, another reminder of our different stations. But this time, it didn't land with the same sting. As I listened to her grumble about interest rates and cosigners, a strange clarity settled over me. Lena was right. We were on different paths. My path was hard, and it was lonely in this small room, but it was built on a foundation I was making myself. It was solid. Hers, for all its glittering surface, seemed fragile. It depended on the whims of a father, the approval of sorority sisters, the shifting sands of social status. I didn't say anything else. I just bent my head over my work, the sound of Chloe's frustrated sighing a faint backdrop to the quiet certainty growing inside me. The divide was no longer a source of shame for me. It was simply a fact. We were headed in opposite directions, and for the first time, I was okay with that. The Georgia rain wasn't the gentle mist of storybooks. It was a relentless, cold downpour that had turned the training grounds into a churning sea of red clay and misery. It was the kind of rain that found its way under your collar, soaked through your supposedly waterproof boots, and turned every piece of gear into a lead weight. A fitting baptism for my first time leading the field training exercise. I was 19, a sophomore, and the chevrons on my uniform felt less like an honor and more like a target. Vance, your team is a disorganized mess. This is a tactical movement, not a sorority charity walk. Master Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the drumming rain, devoid of any sympathy. He stood under the relative shelter of a pine tree, arms crossed, his expression as immovable as granite. He'd been riding me hard all morning, a stark contrast to the quiet encouragement he offered during our one-on-one sessions. Lena, water streaming from the brim of her patrol cap, shot me a look that was pure, undiluted solidarity. "He's in a mood," she muttered, her voice low enough that only I could hear it over the squelching of our boots. "He's always in a mood. This is just his happy mood," I whispered back, my eyes scanning the map clutched in my wet hands. The ink was starting to bleed. The objective was a grid coordinate 2 clicks east, but a simulated chemical attack had just been called in, rerouting us through a steep, wooded ravine. My team of 6 looked to me, their faces young and expectant beneath the dripping camouflage paint. They were waiting for a plan, for leadership. I felt a flutter of the old insecurity, the ghost of Chloe's dismissive laughter from the dorm. "Aeronautical engineering? Aren't you just setting yourself up for a lifetime of hard work?" I pushed the memory aside. Hard work was the point. It was the entire foundation of the path I'd chosen. "All right, listen up," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended, channeling Miller's own no-nonsense tone. I pointed to the map, tracing a new route. "Albright, you're on point. Petrova, rear security. The rest of you maintain 5-meter intervals. This ravine is a nightmare for ambushes, so keep your heads on a swivel. MOPP gear level 4. Now." There was a grumble, but it was the good-natured kind, the sound of shared suffering. They moved, a well-oiled machine slipping into the uncomfortable confines of the protective suits and masks. The world shrank to the limited view of my mask's lens, my own breath loud in my ears. As we descended into the ravine, the rain on the hood of my suit became a dull roar. The mud was deeper here, sucking at our boots with a visceral, hungry sound. We were halfway through when the simulated IED went off, a loud crack from a pyro charge Miller had hidden. 2 of my team, Carson and Jaiwi, were immediately designated as casualties by the evaluating cadre. "Casualties, 2 down," someone yelled, the voice muffled by the mask. Panic threatened, a cold spike in my gut. This was the test. This was exactly what Miller was waiting for me to fail. I dropped to a knee beside Carson, my training overriding the fear. "Triage, assess the scenario. Secure the perimeter. Petrova, establish a 360-degree security cordon. Albright, get on the horn and call in the 9-line medevac now. Simmons, you're with me on casualty care." The orders came out clipped, automatic. I was no longer thinking about the rain or the mud or Miller's judging eyes from the ridge above. There was only the problem and the steps to solve it. We worked quickly, applying simulated tourniquets, logging times, coordinating the fictional evac. My world was the grit under my knees, the weight of the simulated wounded airman, the precise, calm repetition of procedure. When the all-clear was finally called, we were all breathing heavily, soaked through with sweat and rain. Miller walked down into the ravine, his boots making deep impressions in the mud. He stopped in front of me. I braced for the critique, for the list of everything I'd done wrong. Instead, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "You kept your head. You used your team. The medevac request was textbook." He paused, his eyes, the color of weathered steel, holding mine. "The objective was a secondary concern to the preservation of your people. You understood the assignment, Lieutenant." He never called me that before. It was a title I hadn't yet earned, a future rank. But in that moment, in that muddy ravine, he was seeing the officer I was struggling to become. The praise was so understated, so characteristically Miller, that it meant more than any effusive compliment. He turned to the group. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's move out. Vance, take us home." The hot shower back at the barracks felt like a religious experience. The water sluicing off me ran red with Georgia clay. Lena, in the next stall, was humming a off-key tune, a sure sign she was pleased. "Miller called you Lieutenant," she said, raising her voice over the water. I think I saw him almost smile. It was terrifying. "He was probably just having gas," I replied, but I couldn't keep the grin off my face. The high of competent action, of earned respect, was a drug far more potent than any party Chloe had ever tried to drag me to. The contrast between my world and Chloe's was never starker than when I returned to the dorm that evening. Our room, once a study in contrasting halves, had evolved. My side was now a gallery of laminated checklists, aeronautical charts, and a growing collection of leadership books with dog-eared pages. Hers was a curated museum of luxury, though I'd begun to notice subtle shifts. The parade of shopping bags had slowed. The new designer handbag that appeared one week was gone the next, returned, I suspected. That night, she was surrounded by a sea of silk and satin, agonizing over which dress to wear to a law school mixer. Her father, she explained with a sigh that was more performance than genuine emotion, was insisting she make connections at Stanford. It's like he thinks I can't get in on my own merit, she said, holding a sapphire blue dress against her front. She changed her major 3 times, finally settling on political science, declaring it versatile. I'm sure you'll charm them all, I said, my voice neutral. I was hunched over my thermodynamics textbook, trying to ignore the throbbing ache in my muscles. She frowned at my tone, mistaking my exhaustion for judgment. Not all of us have the military to fall back on, Eve. Some of us have to actually network. The comment was a familiar needle, one she'd been using with increasing frequency. The real confrontation happened not in our dorm, but in the hallowed, oak-paneled lecture hall of Professor Albright. It was senior year. I was in his advanced economic theory class because it fulfilled a requirement and, I'll admit, because I wanted to prove I could master his intellectual gauntlet. He was a brilliant man, with a mind like a razor and a withering disdain for any institution he deemed anti-intellectual, the military sitting squarely at the top of that list. That day, he was lecturing on opportunity cost, the value of the road not taken. He was in fine, cynical form. And so, the individual who chooses a path that offers immediate, guaranteed security, a government pension, for instance, often does so at the profound expense of their intellectual and entrepreneurial potential, he intoned, peering over his spectacles at the class. They trade the uncertainty of greatness for the bland assurance of the mediocre. They become a cog. A comfortable, well-oiled cog, but a cog nonetheless. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Then his gaze, sharp and predatory, landed on me. I was, as always, in uniform, having come straight from ROTC. Cadet Vance, you're headed for the Air Force, I understand, an officer, a cog maker in training. A few snickers rippled through the room. My spine straightened. Lena, sitting beside me, went very still. Tell us, from an economic standpoint, how do you justify the opportunity cost of your career choice, the innovations you won't discover in a private lab, the wealth you won't generate in the free market, the sheer intellectual stagnation of unquestioning service? The room was silent. It wasn't a question, it was a provocation, a public dissection. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I saw Chloe, a few rows ahead, turn slightly, a look of morbid curiosity on her perfectly made-up face. She was waiting for me to stammer, to confirm every condescending assumption she and Albright shared. I took a slow breath, hearing Miller's voice in my head. Don't get emotional, state your facts, know your why. I stood up. The uniform felt heavier, but also like armor. Professor, with respect, your analysis is based on a flawed premise, I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying to the back of the room. You assume service is unquestioning. I'd argue there is no environment that requires more critical, rapid, and consequential thinking than leading airmen in a dynamic threat environment. You assume it's intellectually stagnant. I'm an aeronautical engineer. I will be working on, and eventually leading teams that push the very boundaries of aerospace technology, the very innovations you value. I took another breath, my focus narrowing until it was just me and Albright's cool, analytical gaze. As for opportunity cost, you're measuring it solely in monetary and individualistic terms. You're not accounting for the value of purpose, the value of defending the economic system that allows for your free market, the value of oath-keeping, the value of being part of something vastly larger than yourself. My starting salary won't be what a private sector engineer might make. But my compensation isn't just a paycheck, it's the trust of the people I'll lead. It's the integrity of the institution I represent. It's the security, not just for me, but for the country I serve. That's an ROI your models can't quantify, sir. I sat down, the silence was absolute. Professor Albright looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He gave a slow, deliberate blink. "A cog with a well-rehearsed soliloquy," he said finally, but the bite was gone from his voice, replaced by a tone of mere clinical observation. Class dismissed. As everyone filed out, buzzing with the aftermath of the exchange, Chloe fell into step beside me. Her usual glibness was absent. She looked pensive, almost unsettled. "Well, you certainly told him," she said, her voice unusually quiet. We stepped out into the bright sunshine. "I guess it's nice that you have it all figured out, that you have all that security." The way she said security made it sound like a life sentence. It wasn't a compliment. It was the only word from my entire argument that she'd apparently latched onto, the only concept her worldview could process. I stopped walking and turned to her. "It's not about having it figured out, Chloe. It's about having a foundation. There's a difference." She gave a brittle, hollow laugh. "A foundation of rules and uniforms and yes sir, no sir. Sounds thrilling. Tell me, Eve, does the Air Force issue you a personality to go with that foundation, or is that extra?" The barb was meant to hurt, but it was lazy, recycled. I could see the anxiety in her eyes. The gossip around campus was that her father's real estate empire was over-leveraged and beginning to teeter. The golden safety net was fraying, and she was starting to freefall. "No," I said, my voice soft with a pity I knew she would hate. "They expect you to bring your own." I left her standing on the sun-drenched quad, a beautiful, lonely figure surrounded by people, yet utterly untethered. The culmination of it all was the commissioning ceremony. It was held in the university auditorium, a world away from the muddy training fields. I stood on the stage with a dozen other cadets, my uniform pressed to a razor's edge, my shoes gleaming. My parents were in the third row, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, my father's chest puffed out with a pride I'd never seen before. They looked older, wearier than other parents there. The years of double shifts and financial worry were etched on their faces, but in that moment they were radiant. They had sacrificed for this. I had sacrificed for this. I recited the oath of office, my voice echoing in the hall, my hand raised. The weight of the words settled on me, solemn and profound. I was no longer a cadet. I was an officer in the United States Air Force. After the ceremony, Master Sergeant Miller found me. He was in his dress blues, his chest a constellation of ribbons and medals earned over a lifetime of service. He didn't smile, but his eyes were warm. "Second Lieutenant Vance," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, grounding. "It's been a privilege." "Thank you, Master Sergeant, for everything." My voice threatened to crack. This man had been more than an instructor. He'd been the uncompromising standard I measured myself against, the father who showed up when mine was too tired to, the mentor who believed in the version of me I couldn't yet see. "Don't thank me," he grunted, though I saw the faintest hint of emotion around his eyes. "Just do the job, remember your people, remember your why, now go be someone's problem." It was the most affectionate dismissal I could have ever hoped for. I found my parents, hugged them, let them take 1,000 pictures. As we moved through the crowd, I saw Chloe. She was standing with a small group of friends, holding a single, perfect yellow rose someone had given her. She was smiling, the old dazzling, effortless smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. They were scanning the room, looking at the proud families, the clear-eyed, directed graduates. I saw a flicker of it then, not just anxiety, but a profound, gut-wrenching dread. She was 22 years old, buried under a mountain of student debt her parents could no longer cover, with a degree she had no passion for and no plan whatsoever. The path of least resistance had run straight off a cliff. 2 days later, I was packing my car. My life fit into the trunk and back seat of my used Honda Civic with room to spare. A few uniforms, my engineering textbooks, a small box of personal effects. It was a clean, uncomplicated departure. I carried the last box down from the dorm. The door to our room was open. Chloe was sitting on the floor, her back against her stripped-down bed. She was surrounded not by silk dresses or shopping bags, but by a sprawling, chaotic mess of papers. Brightly colored brochures with bold, alarming headlines: student loan consolidation, debt relief now, manage your financial future. She held one in her hand, her knuckles white, her eyes staring at a column of terrifying numbers, but seeing something far, far worse. She was perfectly still, her face a mask of quiet horror, as the true, crushing weight of her choices settled onto her slender shoulders. I stood in the doorway for a moment, a second lieutenant with a secure paycheck, a purpose, and a 7-hour drive to my first base. Our eyes met. There was no common ground left between us, no bridge of understanding to cross. There was only the vast, echoing space of our diverged lives. I gave her a small, sad nod, a final, silent goodbye to the roommate I'd never really known. She didn't nod back. She just stared, her future collapsing in around her while mine was finally, solidly, beginning. I turned, walked to my car, and drove away. The world above didn't exist. Not really. Not when I was down here. The only things that were real were the low hum of the ventilation, the sterile glow of the indicator lights, and the weight of the keys against my chest. 8 years. It felt like a lifetime, and it felt like I'd just stepped out of Miller's classroom yesterday. My world was a capsule, 10 feet by 12, buried under 50 feet of reinforced concrete and steel. The Launch Control Center was a study in controlled tension, a place where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. To my right, First Lieutenant Ben Carter, my deputy for this 24-hour alert shift, was methodically working through a systems checklist. The soft clack of his keyboard was a metronome in the silence. Outside our capsule, somewhere in the vast, empty plains of Montana, was our other half, another crew in an identical capsule, both of us required to turn our keys to start Armageddon. The concept was so vast, so abstract, that you had to shrink it down to the immediate, the tangible. The checklist, the procedure, the duty. Capsule power nominal, Carter murmured, his eyes scanning the bank of screens. Confirmed, I responded, my voice calm, a practiced neutrality that belied the gravity of our task. Captain Evelyn Vance, Missile Combat Crew Commander. The title was a heavy coat I'd grown into, woven with threads of discipline Miller had first handed me and reinforced by years of training, evaluation, and the quiet, grinding reality of the job. My console was a landscape of switches, buttons, and screens, a symphony of potential energy waiting for a command that I prayed would never come. This was my purpose, carved out of a need for something solid, something that mattered beyond designer labels and social climbing. I thought of Chloe Davenport, as I often did in the long, quiet hours. I wondered what her world looked like now. Probably something with more sunlight, less concrete. The alert console chimed, a soft, insistent tone that snapped the air taut. Carter and I exchanged a glance, a silent communication honed over countless drills. This was it. Not the real thing, it was never the real thing, but a test, a measure of our readiness. Simulated emergency action message, I said, my hands already moving, my mind shifting into the hyper-focused state the job demanded. Authenticating. The codes on the screen matched the ones in the red binder. My heart was a steady drum against my ribs, not from fear, but from a deep, resonant focus. This was the moment Miller had prepared me for, not with kindness, but with relentless pressure. The memory of his voice, gruff and unforgiving during that rain-soaked field exercise, was a ghost in the capsule. Think, Vance, what's your priority? Your team is counting on you to not get them killed. Authentication confirmed, I said, initiating launch sequence. The procedure was a dance, a precise, unemotional series of steps. My voice was flat as I called out each action. Enable launch. A switch flipped with a satisfying, heavy click. Launch sequence initiated. Lights on the console shifted from green to amber. In my head, I was no longer in the capsule. I was a link in a chain, a single point in a system designed for a horror I could scarcely comprehend. The weight of it was a physical pressure, a cold stone in my gut. This was the burden I had chosen, the purpose I had clawed for. Carter mirrored my actions, his own voice a steady echo. We were a team, a single organism operating with flawless, chilling precision. The drill continued, a simulated countdown ticking away on the main display. My fingers hovered over the final key switches, the ones that would require a simultaneous turn with my counterpart in the other capsule. Stand by for execute command. The simulated voice from command post crackled in my headset. I placed my hands on the keys. The metal was cool and smooth. This was the culmination of everything. The years of ROTC, the late nights studying, the sacrifices, it all distilled down to this moment, this potential. The weight of the coin, the challenge coin Miller had given me at my commissioning, a simple token that represented an unspoken promise, felt heavier than ever in my pocket. Execute command received, I said, my voice unwavering. Turning keys. The drill ended as they always did, with a termination message and a return to standby status. The amber lights winked back to green. The simulated countdown vanished from the screen. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. Good drill, Captain, Carter said, letting out a slow breath. You too, Ben Flawless. I leaned back in my chair, the adrenaline receding like a tide, leaving behind a familiar weariness. It was a good tired, an earned tired. But it was a deep fatigue that settled into the bones, a product of the responsibility, the isolation, the sheer psychological toll of holding a sword of Damocles that you never, ever wanted to drop. Later, in the small, utilitarian crew quarters on the surface, I checked my personal laptop during a break. The world above filtered in through a weak Wi-Fi signal. Amid the usual notifications, a message from Lena, a news alert, was a name I hadn't seen in years. Chloe Davenport, a Facebook message. The preview text was innocuous enough. Hey Eve, long time. Saw you're stationed in Montana? I'm actually not too far, would love to catch up if you have time. I stared at the message. Chloe, the girl who had once wrinkled her nose at my ROTC uniform, who had measured a person's worth by the logo on their bag. 8 years. I clicked open the message. It was polite, breezy, full of the same practiced charm I remembered. But underneath the casual tone, I sensed a tension, a need. She mentioned she was in Bozeman, figuring some things out. She asked if I'd be on leave soon and if I'd like to meet for coffee. I thought about ignoring it. My life was simple, structured. Chloe represented a past I'd consciously left behind, a world of drama and superficiality I had no patience for. But curiosity, and perhaps a lingering sense of that old, unspoken competition, got the better of me. I typed a reply, brief and professional. I have leave next weekend. Coffee works. Let me know a time and place. I hit send before I could change my mind. The coffee shop she chose was in downtown Bozeman, one of those places with reclaimed wood tables, local art on the walls, and the rich, acidic smell of high-end espresso beans. It was a world away from the stale coffee and industrial carpet of the base. I arrived exactly on time, wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray sweater. It felt strange, after weeks in a flight suit or blues, to be so unaffiliated. I saw her before she saw me. She was seated in a corner booth facing the door. For a moment, the 8 years vanished. She was still beautiful, with that same expertly styled blonde hair and sharp features, but the details were wrong. The camel hair coat draped over the booth was a classic, but on closer inspection, I could see it was frayed at the cuffs. The large designer handbag on the seat beside her was a model from several seasons ago, the leather scuffed. It was like looking at a high-resolution photograph, where the cracks were finally visible. She looked up, and a brilliant, familiar smile lit up her face. Eve, oh my God, you look amazing. She stood up and air-kissed my cheek, a cloud of expensive but fading perfume enveloping me. Chloe, you too. I slid into the booth opposite her. I can't believe it's been so long, she gushed, her eyes scanning me with a practiced efficiency. You look so capable. Military life agrees with you. It's a living, I said, keeping my tone neutral. The conversation was a minefield of pleasantries. She talked about Bozeman, how it was up and coming, how she'd moved there after a stint in Seattle. Her sentences were littered with brand names and vague references to projects and opportunities, but they lacked any concrete substance. She asked about my work, and I gave her the standard, sanitized version. I'm in the Air Force. I work with missile systems. I could see the glazed look in her eyes, the polite disinterest of someone who couldn't connect my job with any concept of prestige or glamour. After our second coffee, she suggested we move on to drinks. There's a cute wine bar just down the street. My treat. The offer came a little too quickly. The wine bar was dimmer, more intimate. The first glass of Pinot Grigio loosened her tongue. The polished chatter began to crack. So, what are you really doing in Bozeman, Chloe? I asked, deciding to stop playing the game. She took a long sip of wine, her manicured nails tapping against the glass. The smile she gave me was brittle. Oh, you know, taking a breather. The real estate market in Seattle was just brutal. I thought you were in fashion marketing, I said, remembering her college ambitions. A shadow crossed her face. That was a long time ago. I dabbled. It's a tough industry. All these kids with rich daddies funding their startup labels. The bitterness was unmistakable. She signaled the waiter for another glass. What about you, really? Sitting in a bunker all day? That can't be what you dreamed of. It's not about dreaming, I said. It's about duty. It's a job that needs doing. She let out a short, sharp laugh. Duty? God, that sounds so grim. Remember Professor Albright? He used to say military service was the last refuge of the unemployable. She said it with a flicker of her old condescension, a ghost of the girl who had sat in those lectures, nodding along. I felt a familiar, cold anger stir, but it was tempered by the weariness in her eyes. I remember. I also remember he drove a Porsche and lived in a gated community. Everyone serves something, Chloe. A country, a corporation, a paycheck. The question is what you get in return. The second glass of wine arrived, and she drank half of it in one go. The facade was crumbling fast. What I got in return, she said, her voice dropping, is a mountain of debt so high I can't see the top. What I got was a series of dead-end jobs for men who patted me on the head and called me sweetheart. What I got was a life that looks nothing like the one I was supposed to have. There it was, the raw, unvarnished truth. The coffee shop charade was over. The supposed to have is the problem, I said quietly. You were always chasing a picture from a magazine. And you were, she shot back, her eyes flashing. You were so desperate to prove you were better than your circumstances. Joining the military, playing soldier, you thought it made you noble. I thought it made you a sucker. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and ugly. This was the confrontation we'd never had in college. It wasn't about being noble, I said, my voice low and steady. It was about building something that was mine, something that couldn't be taken away by a bad economy or a fickle boss. You built your life on sand, Chloe, on credit and connections. I built mine on concrete. Tears welled in her eyes, but she angrily wiped them away, smudging her perfect eyeliner. Don't you dare judge me. You have no idea what it's like. The pressure to keep up, to maintain the image. My family, every holiday, every phone call, it's when are you going to settle down? When are you going to make something of yourself? Her voice cracked. I'm 32 years old, Eve. I'm drowning. I'm living in a studio apartment I can't afford, and I'm so tired. She looked down at her hands, at the expensive but empty wine glass. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft jazz from the bar's speakers. When she spoke again, her voice was a broken whisper. I used to feel sorry for you, In college, I thought you were missing out on everything. The parties, the fun, the freedom. I thought your life was so small. She looked up, her gaze meeting mine, full of a devastating clarity. But it was me. My life was small. It was all just stuff. And now the stuff is gone. She took a shaky breath. Was I the loser all along? The question hung in the air, a verdict she was asking me to deliver. I looked at her, at the shattered remains of the girl who had once ruled our dormitory with a dismissive flick of her wrist. I felt no triumph, no schadenfreude. Instead, I felt a profound, somber sadness. We had chosen different paths, and the universe had rendered its judgment with brutal fairness. There are no losers, Chloe, I said finally. Just choices and consequences. She nodded slowly, fresh tears tracking through her makeup. She didn't argue. She just sat there, stripped bare of her armor, finally defeated. I paid the tab. She didn't protest. We walked out into the cold Montana night, the silence between us now a different, heavier thing. I offered her a ride, but she refused, saying she wanted to walk. I watched her go, a solitary figure in a worn-out coat, disappearing into the dark. Driving back to the base, the lights of the town giving way to the vast, star-dusted blackness of the plains, I felt the weight of the day settle on me. The weight of the keys, the weight of Chloe's confession. Her burden was debt, regret, a life lived for the approval of others. My burden was the silent, profound responsibility for a power I hoped to never use. One was chaotic, a mess of bad decisions and crumbling facades. The other was ordered, a deliberate acceptance of a heavy mantle. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, the base a distant constellation of lights on the horizon. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool, hard metal of Miller's Challenge coin. I ran my thumb over its raised emblem. He had given me a compass, not a map. Chloe had spent her life chasing a map drawn by someone else, and now she was lost. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, anchored by a purpose that was both a privilege and a prison. There was no victory in this reversal of fortunes, only a quiet, sobering understanding of the price we had each paid for our choices. The night air was cold and clean. I took a deep breath and headed home. The blue wool of the service dress jacket felt heavier than usual as I fastened the last button at my neck. It wasn't the fabric, it was the weight of the silver oak leaf clusters pinned to the epaulets. Lieutenant Colonel. I let the words settle in the quiet of my base housing quarters, the morning sun cutting a sharp line across the polished toe caps of my shoes. 12 years. It felt like a lifetime, and it felt like yesterday. My fingers traced the raised edge of one oak leaf, the metal cool and firm. I remembered the first time I'd put on a uniform, the cheap polyester of the ROTC issue feeling like a costume I hadn't yet earned. Master Sergeant Miller had circled me, a critical eyebrow raised. "A uniform isn't armor, Cadet Vance," he'd grumbled. "It's a promise that you'll live up to the standard it represents." This morning, the promise felt more significant than ever. On my dresser, propped against a small wooden box containing my grandfather's dog tags, was a single envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a loopy, feminine script that seemed out of place amidst the stark geometry of my pre-ceremony routine. I'd found it in my mailbox yesterday and had left it there, a strange artifact from a life I'd left behind. I knew who it was from. The return address, a P.O. box in a city I knew Chloe Davenport would have once considered beneath her, confirmed it. I picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive, a last vestige of her old life. I slid a thumb under the flap and pulled out a single sheet. The letter began without a salutation. "I'm not sure you'll even read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I heard through a mutual acquaintance, well, through my father, who still seems to have his fingers in every pie, that you're taking command of a squadron soon. A missile squadron." I had to look up what that meant, and when I did, all I could think was, of course she is. I'm writing this from a coffee shop that would have made my old self shudder. There's a stain on the table, and the espresso is bitter. But it's affordable. That's a word I've become very familiar with. Affordable. Budget. Austere. My vocabulary has expanded in ways Professor Albright never intended. You were right, Eve. Not that you ever said it, which is the worst part. You were right by simply existing. All that talk about purpose over prestige, I thought it was a justification, a story you told yourself to feel better about not having the best things. I was so blind. The prestige I chased was a gilded cage, and the debt I accumulated to maintain the illusion became the lock. It all crumbled spectacularly. My marriage, my credit, the facade of the perfect life. I'm starting over in every sense. I'm in financial counseling, can you believe it? Me balancing a checkbook. I'm not telling you this for pity. I'm telling you because I finally understand the discipline you had all along. The discipline I mocked. You built something real, something that couldn't be repossessed. I see that now. I looked for the easy path, and it led me straight off a cliff. You took the hard road, and it made you unshakable. Thank you for being a silent example, even when I was too arrogant to see it. And congratulations, Eve, truly. Chloe. I read it twice, the words blurring slightly on the second pass. There was no plea for forgiveness, no dramatic reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement, plain and simple. The resentment I'd carried for years, that sharp little stone of memory, seemed to dissolve, leaving behind something softer, more complex. Empathy. I felt a genuine pang of sympathy for the woman she had been, and a flicker of respect for the woman she was trying to become. We had both been sculpted by our choices, just in vastly different ways. A car horn sounded outside, 2 short, polite beeps. Lena, right on time. I folded the letter, slipped it back into its envelope, and placed it in the top drawer of my dresser. It was a piece of the past, acknowledged and filed away. Today was about the future. Lena leaned against her sedan, her own service dress immaculate, the silver leaves on her shoulders matching mine. A grin split her face, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Look at you, Colonel, still managing to look serious on the happiest day of your life." "It's not a happy day, it's a solemn one," I said, repeating the line we'd heard a dozen times throughout our careers. "Bull," she laughed, opening the passenger door for me with a flourish. "It's both, and you're allowed to enjoy it. Even you, Eve Vance, are allowed to crack a smile when you take command of a nuclear missile squadron." I did smile then, sliding into the seat. The familiar scent of her car, leather cleaner, and the faint, permanent smell of jet fuel from her last staff job was comforting. "I'll smile after the ceremony, when I don't have to give a speech." "Your speech is fine, it's very you." She got in and started the engine. all about stewardship and responsibility, very noble. I, for one, was hoping for more fire and brimstone. We will vaporize our enemies, something with punch. That's why you're in operations and not public affairs, I deadpanned. The drive to the base theater, where the ceremony was being held, was short. The familiar landscape of the missile base rolled by, manicured lawns, low-slung, utilitarian buildings, and the vast, silent prairie stretching to the horizon. It was a place of stark beauty and profound purpose. My home. The theater was already filling up when we arrived. The air hummed with quiet conversation and the rustle of service dress. Rows of airmen, NCOs, and officers sat in disciplined lines. I saw faces I knew well, my soon-to-be squadron members, their expressions a mix of formality and genuine anticipation. My eyes scanned the front row, and there he was. Master Sergeant David Miller, retired, sat ramrod straight, his civilian suit unable to conceal the military bearing etched into his spine. His hair was more silver than pepper now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but the gaze was the same, sharp, assessing, and filled with a quiet pride that made my throat tight. He gave me a nearly imperceptible nod, a gesture that conveyed more than 1,000 words. Beside him, Lena squeezed my arm before taking her seat, leaving me to stand with the other dignitaries at the side of the stage. The ceremony began with the precise, ritualized cadence of military tradition. The posting of the colors, the national anthem, the invocation. It was a script I had seen countless times, but today I was a central character. My heart beat a steady, strong rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't like the simulated alerts in the LCC. This was real, irreversible. The presiding officer, a brigadier general I respected deeply, took the podium. He spoke about the mission, the history of the squadron, and the importance of the nuclear deterrent. His words were formal, but they landed with gravity. Then he called my name. Lieutenant Colonel Evelyn Vance, front and center. I walked onto the stage, my steps measured, the sound of my heels on the wooden floor echoing in the hushed theater. I saluted the general, my hand snapping to my brow in a crisp, clean motion. He recited the formal words of the assumption of command, his voice echoing under the high ceiling. I repeated after him, the words feeling both immense and intimately familiar. "Do you accept this command?" "I do, sir." The general stepped back and I turned to face the audience, now the commander of the 742nd Missile Squadron. For a moment, the silence was absolute. I looked out at the sea of faces, my squadron. I saw Senior Master Sergeant Timmons, who could troubleshoot a malfunctioning guidance system in his sleep. I saw Lieutenant Carter, fresh from the LCC, his youthful face set in an expression of intense seriousness. I saw Master Sergeant Miller, his eyes glistening. And I saw Lena, grinning like a fool, her thumbs up barely visible from the stage. I walked to the podium, my notes waiting. But I didn't need them. The speech I had written was safe, proper, and full of the expected platitudes. But as I gripped the sides of the wooden stand, Chloe's letter and a decade of memories seemed to coalesce into a clarity I hadn't expected. "Good morning," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "A wise man once told me that a uniform is a promise to live up to a standard." I glanced at Master Sergeant Miller, and he gave another slight nod. "For 12 years, I've tried to keep that promise. Today, that promise expands. It is no longer just about my own conduct. It is about this command, about all of you." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the rows of airmen. We have a unique mission, one that, frankly, most of the world doesn't understand and hopes to never think about. We are not here for glory. You will never see our names in headlines for a successful mission, because our success is measured in silence. In stability. Our charge is one of profound trust. The trust of our nation, and of every nation, that we will be the steady hand, the unwavering guardians of a peace that is, by its very nature, fragile. I saw shoulders straighten, eyes lock onto mine. This was what they needed to hear, not about power, but about responsibility. I have heard our mission described as a necessary evil. I reject that characterization. What we do is a necessary good. It is the ultimate expression of a nation's desire to protect its people without having to wage war. It is a commitment to a future where the weapons we maintain are never used. That is our solemn duty. That is our shared promise. I spoke of standards, not just in our technical proficiency, but in our integrity. I spoke of the need to support one another, to be a family, because the weight we carried was not meant for solitary shoulders. I spoke for maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. When I finished with a simple, "I am honored to be your commander," the applause was not just polite, it was resonant, filled with a sense of shared purpose. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of handshakes, salutes, and congratulations. I stood in a receiving line, my cheek sore from smiling, my hand aching from the firm grips of colleagues and subordinates. Finally, the crowd began to disperse. I found Master Sergeant Miller waiting for me near the stage, his hands clasped behind his back. "Well, Colonel," he said, the title sounding both strange and right coming from him. "It's still Eve, Master Sergeant, always." A real smile, rare and wonderful, broke across his face. "That was a good speech. You didn't read it." "I changed it at the last minute." "I know, it was better, spoke from the heart, not the regulation." He looked me up and down, his mentor's eye missing nothing. "Your father would be proud, your mother too." The mention of my parents, who had sacrificed so much for my college education, who had worried silently through every deployment, brought a fresh wave of emotion. "Thank you, David, for everything, for seeing something in a scared kid in an ill-fitting uniform." "I didn't see anything you didn't already have," he said gruffly. "I just helped you polish it." He reached out and shook my hand, his grip still firm. "Congratulations, Colonel, you earned this." After he left, Lena looped her arm through mine. "Okay, now the real work begins. But first, lunch, my treat, and you are going to eat something that isn't a protein bar for once." We went to a quiet restaurant off base, and for an hour, we were just Eve and Lena again, dissecting the ceremony, gossiping about mutual acquaintances, and laughing like the cadets we once were. It was a necessary anchor to normality before I returned to the base, to my new office. The Squadron building was quiet, the day's formalities over. My office was spacious, with a large window that looked out over the parade ground and the endless sky beyond. On my desk was a stack of incoming correspondence and a folder labeled "Commander's Welcome Package." I ignored it for now. I stood at the window, watching the sun begin its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The weight of the day, the emotion, the significance, settled over me, but it wasn't a crushing weight. It was a mantle, a purpose. My thoughts drifted back to Chloe's letter. We had started from the same point, two 18-year-olds in a dorm room, and our paths had diverged so dramatically. She had sought a life that looked impressive from the outside. I had, sometimes stumbling, chosen a life that felt meaningful on the inside. There were no winners or losers in that equation anymore. Just two women, 32 years old, finally understanding the cost of the choices they had made. Her path had led to a humble coffee shop and a budget. Mine had led to this window, this command, this sunset. The resentment was truly gone, replaced by a quiet hope that she would find the same sense of fulfillment in her rebuilding that I had found in my building. Our war was over, and it had ended not with a surrender, but with a mutual, distant recognition. A soft knock came at the door. Senior Master Sergeant Timmons stood there, a folder in his hand. "Welcome, Commander. The evening status reports are ready for your review when you have a moment." "Thank you, Senior. I'll take a look now." He nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. I turned from the window and sat at my desk, the leather chair creaking under my weight. I opened the folder, the first official task of my command. The words on the page were familiar, the language of readiness and accountability, but they felt different now. They were mine to own, mine to answer for. I looked out the window one last time. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a final band of gold on the prairie. The missiles were out there, silent and waiting under my command. But as I picked up my pen, I knew my command was not about the power they represented. It was about the people who guarded them, the promise we all shared, and the peaceful night we helped ensure. It was about stewardship. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a deep, unshakable peace. I was exactly where I was meant to be.